Hello, and welcome to season 2 of Fractional Futures, where in each episode I'm speaking to fractional leaders across the globe to get their perspectives on how the fractional leadership model is being embraced by the business landscape. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Henning Schwinum, who is co founder of Vendux, which matches fractional executives to businesses. And Henning is also co founder of Be Fractional. And if that doesn't keep him busy enough, he also operates as a fractional VP of sales and marketing and is founding member of the Fractional Leadership Alliance. So a bit more on that later. Hi, Henning. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Paul. Glad to be here.
And if you don't mind me saying, you have a very German accent for a Californian. How did you end up on the West Coast?
Oh, well, it's a long story and a short story. I came to the U.S. First into Kansas City, Missouri, and it was for a job that was meant to last for a year. Fortunately, I fell in love first with the city and then with a girl, and that was about 11 years ago. And now I'm stuck in the most positive way over here. And 3 years ago, we decided it was time for a change, and we moved from Kansas City to California.
Fantastic. And I'm sure you've got a very good summer over there at the moment. Nice, predictable weather, as you were saying earlier.
Very predictable, sunny. The last rain we saw was back in March, and probably won't rain until November.
You're welcome to have some of our rain if you need it. The summer in the UK has been atrocious. So anyway, enough about the weather. Before we start getting fractional, Henning, can you tell our listeners a little bit about your background before you got into the fractional space?
Yeah, I spent probably 35 years in a career that started out in the chemical industry and involved the last 25 years sales and leading and building sales teams, first in the chemical industry and then selling into that industry. When I was done with that career, my original intent was to be a fractional VP of sales or a fractional chief sales officer. And I realized, and that was about 5 years ago, that I lacked the right connections. I wasn't connected to enough founders, owners, CEOs, board members, investors, startup communities, all those places where you find small and medium-sized businesses who are scaling and who are looking to invest into fractional executives. And then when I looked for an agent who could represent me or a matchmaker who could help me find those roles, I couldn't find one. Because at the time, there was not one that focused on sales leaders. There were those and still are that focus on the entire C-suite. And that to me meant focus on CEOs, COOs, and maybe CFOs. So as a sales leader, I didn't feel represented by those organizations. And so with that in mind, I pivoted and said, I'm just going to build the sales, the matchmaker for sales leaders that I was missing. And the simple product market fit assumption was that what I was missing, others must be missing too. And a few phone calls verified that assumption. And so at this point, we're still really the only one focused on only sales leadership roles.
That's really interesting. And in terms of, I guess, coming into this fractional world, why did it appeal to you? Because obviously you didn't want to go back into the corporate world as a salaried employee. So what was the appeal for you?
Yeah, it wasn't. I mean, I hear a lot about the badness or the downsides of the corporate world. It wasn't that for me. What it was that after 25 years of building and running sales teams, I was tired of running them because running means you are faced with the same excuses and the same questions every day, every week, every month, every quarter. It's the same. It never changes. And I wanted to build something. I wanted to affect change. I wanted to fix broken sales leadership scenarios because for most of my 25 years leading sales teams, I actually sold into sales and marketing organizations. So a VP of sales or a VP of marketing were the decision makers that I sold to. And I saw so many truly broken organizations and examples of really bad sales leadership. And I felt I could, after 25 years, I had enough experience under my belt to come in and fix those organizations and make them better along the way.
And it sounds like you certainly built a few organizations, and we'll go into those a little bit later for the listeners to understand what's keeping you busy. So
Yeah.
I think, Henning, from a UK, it's pretty much acknowledged that the fractional work style kind of originated in the US, and certainly the US is a few years ahead of Europe, which is perhaps slightly further ahead than the Far East. In terms of fractional leadership generally, which of the C-level roles are more embedded in the business landscape?
Yeah. So CFOs are, I call them the granddaddy of fractional sales, of fractional executives, because they've been around the longest. And the CMO and sales leader roles are the last functions that businesses end up fractionalizing. And it comes with the territory. If you think of a fractional CFO, then a company has to grow to a really big size to need to afford a full-time CFO. I mean, you can run a $50 million, $100 million business with a fractional CFO. You don't have to have that function full-time. The window for a fractional sales leader is sooner and shorter, because as soon as you have 5, 7 full-time salespeople, especially in an enterprise sales environment, you need a full-time sales leader in order to be effectively leading that team. And so that tends to happen sooner, in the $5 to $20 million or $5 to $15 million window, and it's a shorter window. And often if you think of a typical scaling company, there's a one-time opportunity to bring in a fractional sales leader, whereas in the 0 to 50 million journey of a company, there are definitely multiple opportunities to bring in a fractional CFO, for example. And to your point of, the US is ahead, I find it interesting because the interim executive concept actually originated in Europe, the Netherlands in particular, but then also other European countries, Germany, Scandinavia, because of tax reasons and employment law reasons. It was a whole lot easier to contract and then cancel or terminate a contract with an interim executive than it is to full-time hire and then have to figure out what to do with the individual. So it's interesting that the fractionalizing part, not the contractor part, but the fractional part, is the one that sort of started in the US and is now making its way into Europe. But it really, even within the US, there are different phases that companies are in. So in the US, it's often tech and SaaS companies who are the first to embrace new organizational models like fractional executives. Manufacturing, more traditional industries tend to be later. And so in the US, you can break it down and say that most tech and SaaS companies work with fractional executives, whereas on the manufacturing side, that's far less the case. And so I think there's just very much of a movement, and because of the fact that we're all interconnected now globally, I think these models travel a whole lot faster. And if it feels like the UK is 5 or 10 years behind the US in that regard, it'll catch up really quickly, and then we won't be talking about being behind or one being ahead of the other anymore.
And you mentioned the how different sectors have embraced the model. As the model's been generally accepted in the US. Have there been any states where it started first and it's migrated across? Was it Silicon Valley where it started, or where did it sort of originate in the US?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, so because the roots go into tech and SaaS, um, it had a cradle in the Bay Area in Silicon Valley, but also all the other places where you have a concentration of tech companies in Chicago, New York, in Texas, in Florida. I mean, there are tech hubs now throughout the U.S. So the journey was a really fast one, and I think the pockets that are lagging behind today in the U.S. are areas where there is less tech, more traditional manufacturing. In there, the message and the word has to be spread a little bit more. Whereas you don't have to make an introduction to the fractional executive concept in Silicon Valley.
If we were to rewind, 5 or so years, when the fractional model was forming in the US,
Hmm.
how was this model embraced by business leaders? Because in the UK, we're having to do a lot of education across the business landscape to explain what the model is, why it's different from a non-exec director role, why it's different to a traditional consultancy role. Did you have similar problems in the early stages in the US, having to educate the business landscape?
Absolutely. I mean, I started Vendux about 5 years ago, and 5 years ago, every conversation involved a description of what is a fractional executive and how does it benefit you and your business. Those discussions still happen, but they are far more rare today than they used to be. So it's an interesting change that has happened in just those 5 years. And part of it is that there are more fractional executives in the marketplace today, but there's also a whole lot more experience that business owners, founders, CEOs have with that model. And as soon as they do, it's almost guaranteed that they have a positive experience. And it might not be so much with that particular executive because, let's be honest, things can go sideways also in the fractional model, just like it does in hiring people full time. But the experience with the model itself tends to be positive, and so it's one of those things where if you're in the fractional executive business, like we are with Vendux, going into a company and knowing that they've had fractional executives before makes it a far easier sale than those companies, especially on the manufacturing side, who have not had that experience before.
And I guess something that interests me in terms of, this might be a hard question to answer, but across the landscape generally, how many small, medium-sized businesses have more than 50% of their board as fractional? Does that happen? What's the composition, the typical composition of board of full-time executives versus fractional?
I well, I think it's when we say board, yes, a lot of boards have um, senior executives that are holding several board seats on a part-time basis. But if we think about the executive leadership team, it tends to be that there are maybe one or two fractionals in the mix, together with typically the founder, maybe a full-time CEO, but those roles are then full-time. But so there aren't executive teams that are made up, or they are, but they are not very common, that are made up entirely of fractional executives. I've come across one investor in the 5 years that I've been in this space who publicly went out and said, focus, if you're a tech founder, you focus on building the product, and for the rest, hire fractionals. So it's still, in that regard, not a very prevalent model to go all out fractional. So it's more the case that there are one or two executive team members who are.
And you mentioned there investors. How's the investment community embracing the model? Because I could kind of see that it works for them pretty well, because it's all about rapid transformation, and which enables investors really to sort of go in early, exit early. How's the model being embraced by VCs, private equity?
It's an interesting discussion to have, because in my view, and it might not be shared by someone who is a part of a VC or a private equity group, but I think if you're in that financial investment world, you are very traditional. You have established methods of how to work, especially since a lot of PEs and VCs focus only on a segment of the market, right? They don't invest into just any company. If you're in the medtech space, you invest in the next medtech company. If you're in SaaS, you invest in the next SaaS company, and that breeds a model that is repetitive and that has worked for you, the VC or the private equity group. And so in that, I think they're very conservative and sticking to models that have worked for them. And models that have worked traditionally were that if they saw shortfalls in the leadership of the company that they invested in, they brought in one of their principals. They have an in-house person that they bring in for a couple of months. They have a go-to outside consultant that they bring in, and that they bring in repeatedly because the consultant knows their model and knows what they're looking for and repeats that over and over and over again. So in that, I don't think that PE and VCs were embracing a fractional executive model necessarily. That has changed a little bit, but it's not like they are the big push. So if I think about where our assignments are coming from, it's mostly the founder, owner, or CEO that looks for a solution to a problem, and when they talk to us, we jointly determine that the fractional executive is the solution to their problem. So it's less, we're less, to a lesser extent, brought in by a VC or a private equity group or a board member. It's more founders, owners, and CEOs.
It's really interesting. I think we'll probably see that in the UK as the model becomes more embraced. It'd be interesting to see if UK investors are equally as traditional as their US counterparts. And so, Henning, what for US-based owners, business owners that are, they haven't used the fractional model before, what's the biggest misconception they have about the model, and what sort of counter arguments do you use to sort of convince them that this actually is the right model for them?
So we're particularly focused on the sales leader, and the biggest misconception around those that I see is that business owners think that there is a lack of commitment, right? It's a sort of a hired gun somewhere out there, and maybe they work for you and maybe they don't. And I think it's driven by experience with agency networks or maybe even distributor networks, where as the principal, you have to push hard to make those networks actually work for you, because they represent typically multiple companies and multiple product lines. And so if you want their attention, you really have to work hard. And so they think that the same applies to a fractional executive, and that's a misconception, because the fractional executive is actually, their livelihood is dependent on their reputation. And so when they do a bad job, and the client who hires them talks to other business owners in the same space, their reputation is gone, and therefore they will have a hard time finding the next assignment. They're also very reliant on referrals. If you go in as a fractional executive in a insurtech company, you want a referral to other insurtech founders or owners, so that you can find the next role. And if you do a bad job, then that's not going to happen. And so the result is that you find in reality that a fractional executive is actually more committed to you, to your business, to your company, than the equivalent full-time hire, because of those circumstances. And founders who have or owners who've actually worked with fractional executives will attest to that, whereas those who haven't fall prey to the misconception, and need to be convinced otherwise. And there are actually studies out there that show that contractors are actually at least as reliable and as committed to the company as their full-time hire counterparts. And I've written a blog post about it a while back. But in that context, I searched for data, because knowing and having a sentiment around this is one thing, but to have statistics to actually showcase that this is truly the case is something different. And so I went on the hunt for stats, and wrote a blog post about it.
There's not very many stats out there at the moment, though. I think because it's such a new concept. I've spent 12 months looking for stats, and it's been very, very difficult. It'd be great if there's an organisation that can do some sort of global study on fractional leadership across all the disciplines, across all the countries, just to see where the baseline is. Really, that would be a really welcome study, I think.
I'll take that into the FLA, the Fractional Leadership Alliance.
Absolutely. And Henning, the word fractional is trending. It's on LinkedIn all the time. It's starting to come through on the press. It's a bit of a buzzword. There's misconceptions about what it is and what it isn't. So for those business leaders who are contemplating perhaps bringing in a fractional leader into the business, given your experience of how it's been embraced in the US, what advice would you give to a UK business owner who they want to take the plunge, but they just need that final bit of reassurance to take someone on board? What would you say to them?
So when I talk to business owners, it always is. It really comes down to the question: do you really need that one executive function that you're looking to staff full time? And in sales, the answer is, in a lot of cases, you don't. Because if you have 2 or 3 sales reps, you don't need a full-time sales leader to manage that team, and most certainly not someone who has the experience and the seniority to have done this several times before. Someone with the experience can manage 2 or 3 sales leaders in 20 or 30% of their time. So what if you consider the full-time hire, what do you do with the rest of the time? And in sales, the answer is often the player coach. So somebody who coaches, but also then goes out and sells themselves. And that is a really bad idea, because if you're in that role, you don't really know what to focus on. Are you there to support other team members and make them successful? Or are you there to be successful yourself and make your quota and get the commission or bonuses in return? And so it really boils down to that question: how much of that leadership resource do you need? And you can take that into other functional areas, if you hire a full-time CFO, you probably end up with somebody who also is the head of HR, the chief admin, the office manager. So these functions who wear multiple hats within a company. And while that was the traditional startup model, you just wear multiple hats. If you think about it, you end up with people who do things that they're not really good at. And fractionalizing it and breaking it up is really the way to ensure that for every part, every function of your organization, you're getting someone who has that functional expertise and whose only focus is on that. And financially speaking, it because of the way fractional executives work, you don't end up paying more than you would for full-time hires. You just fractionalize, you break up your investment into, where you had 3 senior executives before, now you have 6 or 7, each focused on their functional areas, and the total quote unquote payroll ends up being the same amount, or virtually the same
amount. Henning, I know you have a truly global perspective on fractional leadership, and we'll go into the Fractional Leadership Alliance in a moment. But thinking ahead, in the next 5 years' time, where's fractional leadership going to be? Is it here to stay? Is it a fad, or will it be more prevalent than it is already?
Well, I definitely am hedging a bet with all my involvement in the fractional world on the fact that it's here to stay. It's a novel or a newer organizational model that has evolved out of a couple of different roots. One being the interim executive model that came out of Europe. Another one is the whole consulting business, where companies, when they needed expertise, brought in consultants. But if you combine all of that, you end up with a fractional executive someone who has the expertise and past experience to be successful, who can truly claim, I've done this before, I've been and I've gone where you, Mr. Business Owner, are now trying to go. And someone who's not just there to share his expertise and then walk out like a consultant, but who's there to actually get the work done. And so I think it is a model that is here to stay. And certainly in 5 years, I expect that the model has penetrated in the U.S. all the different industry segments. As we talked about earlier, it started in SaaS and tech, and 5 years ago, almost all roles were in those industries. It then came into professional services, then into manufacturing, and I expect that in 5 years, the mix of roles across industries will be a reflection of the overall industry share in the marketplace.
That's great to know, because I've hedged all my bets on it as well. So I've left salary, I've left the security of being a salaried employee to setting up VCMO, and I think it's a no-brainer. And I think my personal opinion is that so many businesses work at about 30% of genuine productivity, and I think by leveraging this model, which just plugs the expertise into the business when you need it, I think you'll see an uplift in productivity across all sectors. So yeah, hopefully you're right and we're both right, and we can win in the long term. So Henning, before we close, I'd like you to share a little bit with our listeners about the Fractional Leadership Alliance and its mission. Do you want to spend a few minutes just explaining what the FLA is and its mission?
Be happy to, Paul. When we look around the landscape of fractional executives, then you have a lot of solopreneurs, individuals who are fractional executives who have formed in the U.S. their LLC, their their company that they operate in under, and they hire themselves out under that flag into different companies. And then there is an ecosystem of firms, of organizations who support that group of fractional solopreneurs. And those are companies like mine, Vendux, who are matchmakers, who are job boards, who bring together fractional executives and companies. Then we have communities in the mix, communities that bring together fractional executives, that have an element of learning, that have an element of peer-to-peer education. Then you have education providers, companies who help fractional executives to become successful, who teach them the basics around sales and marketing and all the other things that you have to do successfully in order to be a solopreneur and be successful in your own venture. And and all of these companies are new, right? None of them have been around 20 years. None of them dominate the market or even their vertical, no matter how much they might like to think that they do. And so what is missing here is someone who can speak with a voice, with one unified voice for the industry, the fractional industry as a whole. And the FLA, the Fractional Leadership Alliance, is meant to address that void and be a industry association for the fractional industry that brings together all these voices that exist and speaks then on behalf of the industry. And I always compare it with the any other association that's out there, like the American Automotive Manufacturers Association, who speaks on behalf of all the automotive manufacturers. No one manufacturer has a voice that can be taken as a voice of the industry. So you bring them together in an association, and so FLA is meant to be that and be the voice of the industry. We're brand new. There are 10 founding members, and we are one of them. And we believe we created a mission and vision that we universally believe in, and the overriding mission is to increase the number of opportunities for fractional executives. And speaking with one voice gets the attention of the outside world much more so than if we all as individual companies in that space speak up.
The Fractional Leadership Alliance, it's not US only organization. This is truly global, isn't it?
Yeah. So among our founding members, we have the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand represented. Amongst our membership today, we've added Singapore. We're talking to several in the UK and in Europe. So it is and is going to be even more so a global association, because as we talked about before, the fundamentals of it and the fundamental benefits of it are universal. They're not country specific.
And will you be working with other organizations? I'm thinking aloud here. I'm just thinking of the Chartered Institute of Marketing in the UK, for example, and the equivalents in the Chartered Finance Society, places like that. Are you working with other organizations to collaborate with the FLA, or is it kind of very much an independent alliance?
No, we do intend to work with all these organizations. If we think, outside the UK of larger groups, I'm thinking of Indeed as an example that I use, because I think there is a way that Indeed can benefit from adding and differentiating fractional jobs to their lineup, and in that they need a partner that helps them define what is a fractional executive. in the FLA can become that partner. And likewise, in a lot of other places, I think we do want to work with the outside world in order to define or be the defining voice about what is a fractional executive.
Fantastic stuff. And that's probably a good point to close the show. So if you've been listening or watching this episode, I hope you find value from the discussion and you've been inspired by Henning's story. In our next episode, I'll be speaking to another fractional leader from another part of the world. So stay tuned for that. Henning, thank you again for giving up your time to share your perspectives. I've really enjoyed the show and hearing your perspective on the fractional world. It's been really, really interesting. So thank you for that. And I wish you the very best of luck with the future journey with the FLA and Be Fractional and all the other organizations you're building. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, for having me. It was a pleasure.